So, breaking news coming out, Ange Postecoglou has been sacked by Tottenham Hotspur. It's official, it's confirmed. Ange has put a statement out, and it looks like he's going to be replaced by Thomas Frank. So, we all kind of knew Ange was probably going to be sacked this last week. You know, Tottenham are having conversations with Thomas Frank. You're not really going to have conversations with another manager if you're planning on keeping your manager. I also think the fact that it took so long to clarify said to me, they're probably going to sack him, but like they don't want to sack him right away because fans will be even more angry if you won a trophy and sacked him the next day. Let's have a conversation about this because I personally was leaning towards, as a neutral, as a Manchester United fan, Tottenham keeping Ange Postecoglou. I think, I'm going to talk about reasons why I think they maybe should have kept Ange Postecoglou in a second and why I was leaning more that way. However, we are going to talk about why Tottenham would have sacked Ange Postecoglou for Thomas Frank. I think a lot of Tottenham fans are going to be upset right now, and rightly so. He's won your first trophy in 17 years. If it was my decision, I probably would have kept him. But I'm going to break down probably the real reason why they're probably sacking Ange for Thomas Frank and tell you some positive things about Thomas Frank in this video. But I want to share my thoughts on Ange. I want to share my thoughts on this sacking and all of that first of all. Then we'll talk about Thomas Frank and all of the news. But I'm assuming to sack Ange Postecoglou, unless Tottenham are really stupid, I'm assuming they have a verbal agreement with Thomas Frank. I don't think they would have sacked Ange Postecoglou if they didn't have a manager lined up. It might not be Thomas Frank, but I'm 99% sure it is Thomas Frank, and I'm going to tell you that in a second why. I assume they've had conversations with Thomas Frank. They've had the verbal agreement. Thomas Frank isn't speaking on Flecken leaving. He's not speaking on the Mbuma rumours. Apparently he wants out of Brentford. I reckon there's an agreement with Thomas Frank. They've now got the verbal agreement because they can't do any official agreements to Ange is gone. And they've sacked Ange because they know they can get Thomas Frank in place. I think. That's what I think. If Tottenham have sacked Ange and in a month's time they still haven't got a manager, then they are the biggest idiots in world football. Because Man United went to try and get Thomas Tuchel in. It was really close. Last minute, Thomas Tuchel went no. But we hadn't sacked Ten Hag by then, and then we kept Ten Hag. I think they've been having conversations with managers. They didn't want to do it right after the Europa League because they knew fans weren't going to be happy. If they'd done it last week, fans probably would have been even more cross. I think fans have been expecting it now, but fans are still upset, and rightly so. Now, Thomas Frank and Margot Silva are the two names high up. Thomas Frank is the better of the two. And Ornstein says, Thomas Frank is the leading contender, but there's been no contact between Tottenham and Brentford yet. But we know there's been contact between Thomas Frank and Tottenham. So I'm assuming Tottenham have spoken to Thomas Frank. Thomas Frank said, yep, I'll take the job. And I assume that they are probably working on the deal now. And I think they'll wait a couple of days, and I think this will be done. But you might be thinking, why would they sack him? First trophy in 17 years, first European trophy in 41 years. A lot of the fan base is behind Ange Postecoglou, and he's had all those issues of injuries. If you look at the fact that Ange, when he had Porro, Van der Ven, Romero, and Udogie, those four starting games together, he won in 21 games. He got 16 wins and 2 draws, which would put him, if they were all Premier League games, and he had 21 Premier League games with that back four, he would have got 50 points in those 21 games, which would have put him first above Liverpool for the first 21 games of the season in the Premier League. Like, how insane is that? Like, Ange's form with that back four all fit is Premier League winning form. Ange, when he's had his squad fit, has played some good football. Ange made great tactical adaptations in the Frankfurt game, the Bodo game, and even though Tottenham didn't do anything amazing versus Man United, tactically, Ange made changes and did Amorim. And Ange has shown elements of what he can do, and with the injuries, and the only signing he got last summer that wasn't a teenager was Solanke. He had that injury crisis. He's won the first trophy in 17 years. I would have leaned towards, you know what, he works well with the young players. Look what he's done when the team has been fully fit, to be fair. He's won a trophy. The team is behind him. The players are behind him. I would lean towards keeping Ange Postecoglou myself. I probably would have kept Ange Postecoglou. But I do want to talk about why I think they've sacked him for probably Thomas Frank. And I do want to talk about why I think Thomas Frank will be a really good fit. And I'm not going to talk about this just now. I want to just quickly talk about my opinion on Ange, why he could stay, why he could go. But I want to talk about that in a second. But I obviously did a video on my second channel, More Alice, the other day, talking about Ange, should he be sacked or not. I said it's not really like a yes or no. It's more of you've got to look at it at a deeper thing. I think Ange has had flaws, but he's also brought in something fresh at times. I think, his first season, the football Tottenham were playing was some of the best football they've played in years. I said I would lean towards keeping him, but I think when you are 17th in the league, when you do lose 22 plus games, and obviously of those games, a lot of them were due to injuries, and the last 3 or 4 was because you were focusing on the Europa League. So I feel like you have to take into account some of those losses. I can understand why Tottenham have said, look, we saw enough in the Premier League, he needs to go. But I will say this, and this was one of the reasons I got behind Ange as a Man United fan, because I can sort of understand as a Man United fan with the Glazers. The bigger problem at Tottenham is Daniel Levy. It's the people above the manager. At Man United, we sort of got behind our managers because we've sort of realised every manager comes in and fails. Until you sort out the top of the club, the people doing business, it's not an environment for any manager. And Man United and Tottenham, we've been these graveyards for managers. Thomas Frank is at Brentford. You know, all these other managers Tottenham are linked to, I'm sure, in very good environments. They're going to come to Tottenham and they're going to be working with clowns, people, well, not all clowns, but Daniel Levy, who's not always going to get his checkbook out, that kind of like to do what he did with Poch and not spend a load of money. And it's going to be very difficult because the Premier League's in a place now where in the past you could get away with maybe not spending a bit of money for a season or two, but now you have to. It's so fast moving. Look at the quality of the mid-table teams. And that's something that Levy doesn't want to do. And I think while Ange is gone and while Thomas Frank is a great replacement, I'm going to talk about the real reason why I think you've gone for Thomas Frank, because I assume that's who you're going to get. I mean, you might not get Thomas Frank, and I think then it's a really bad decision sacking Ange. I mean, I still would have leaned towards keeping Ange, but for Thomas Frank, I can somewhat understand it to an extent, and I'm going to explain that in a minute. The bigger problem at Tottenham will always be the people above. It will be very difficult for the next manager to come in with Levy. It's going to be very difficult. It was very difficult for Ange. And while, yes, Ange could have done better, he was not the problem. You can sack managers and you can sack managers and you can sack managers, but you need to fix up at the top of the club. Levy needs to make sure if he's made this unpopular decision to sack Ange after winning the first trophy in 17 years, the next manager he brings in has got to do well. Because look, there was lots of good things that Ange showed. The 3-0 win versus United, the 4-0 win versus City, the start of the season, you know, winning a trophy, you know, his record with his best back four fit. But obviously, yeah, the football Tottenham were playing the second half of the season was atrocious in the Premier League. Yes, he adapted in the Europa League. He didn't adapt in the Premier League games. It was atrocious. It was awful. There was injuries, of course. They were focusing on the Europa League. There was all of that. But it was bad. It was chaotic. I think you let Ipswich beat you. Was it Leicester that beat you? You know? But it all comes back to Daniel Levy. Tottenham is a graveyard for managers like Manchester United. I feel like there's been a lack of consistency, planning, and proper backing of any Tottenham manager. Even, you know, a new coach will come in, and I don't know how much they're going to succeed at Tottenham. I think Thomas Frank is a brilliant coach. You know, I think you could get Hansi Flick, an amazing. You can't get Hansi Flick, but I think you could bring Hansi Flick in, and he would struggle at Tottenham because of Daniel Levy, and he didn't really get anyone at Barcelona this season. But I do think Tottenham is a bit like Man United. It's one of those environments where you could bring a manager in as good as Hansi Flick or Pep Guardiola, but you don't know. They're not a guaranteed success. Whereas I knew Hansi Flick going to Barcelona was guaranteed success. Pep Guardiola going to Man City was guaranteed success. Arne Slot, I felt, was going to be a guaranteed success at Liverpool. But if you go to Manchester United, you go to Tottenham, you're not always a guaranteed success. And Ange might not be perfect, but I did feel that if he got the right support in the summer, had he actually got a top ready-made number 6, had he actually got Mickey van der Ven reliable backup, because that guy is so key, had he actually got a ready-made winger, and not all these young players, and these young players are great and they'll be great for the future, but you need a stable environment to put them in, and Bergwall's been unbelievable. He could have been more successful. He definitely could have been. Now, I understand to an extent why Tottenham have sacked Ange. 17th in the league. Man United stuck with Ten Hag. We got worse. We spent all that money on Ten Hag. We got worse. Now we're behind and having to spend a load of money on Amorim. Tottenham might look at that and say, you know what? We don't want to make the same mistake. And I always said, if Tottenham have Thomas Frank lined up, I can somewhat understand sacking Ange. But if Tottenham had Gareth Southgate lined up, I wouldn't have sacked Ange. I would have been like, you idiots. And it looks like Thomas Frank is lined up. They've had talks with him. Every reliable source says he's the favourites to come. I don't think Tottenham would be stupid enough to sack Ange without a replacement lined up. I don't know this for sure, but I am positive that you probably have a verbal agreement with Thomas Frank. So let's talk about Thomas Frank and why I think it would be a good signing for Tottenham. Now, there's obviously working with Daniel Levy, there's questions. But I know Tottenham fans are going to be upset, but I'm going to try and cheer you up. This is the real reason why I think you could have sacked Ange for Thomas Frank, and why I think Thomas Frank is an unbelievable manager. He was my, if we sacked Ten Hag, option. I actually went for Thomas Frank over Amorim if we sacked Ten Hag, believe it or not. Thomas Frank has overperformed at Brentford for years with a limited budget. Whenever I do Premier League predictions, I'm like, Brentford will get relegated, Brentford will get relegated, Brentford will get relegated. He would stay up every year. I'd be like, Brentford are going to come like 16th and just stay up. He'd come like 10th. You know, he's overperformed at Brentford. He lost key players like Ivan Toney. He adapted. He did incredibly well. and he's very versatile. Now, I don't know what Tottenham see as their best formation. You've been buying players for a number of managers, back five, back four. But with Thomas Frank, he plays 3-5-2, 4-3-3, and 4-2-3-1. And Spurs need that kind of adaptability. There's an argument there that Porro's best in the back five, Spence works in the back five, Udogie works in the back five. You probably don't have enough fit centre backs to play a back five. You've also got, he played a back four the last season. He can do a back four. You can keep going with that. But what stands out to me about Thomas Frank is he's very good at profiling players, getting the best out of them. And that's what Arne Slot's done at Liverpool. Liverpool looked at Xabi Alonso, Ruben Amorim, Arne Slot. Arne Slot came in. He didn't really get any signings, but he looked at Gravenberch and then he went, I'm going to use you as a 6 because you can do this, this, and this. He looked at Cody Gakpo, who Klopp had played as a striker, and put him on the left wing. He looked at Diaz, got the best out of Diaz and spells, got the best out of Salah. He looked at every player and he knew how to set them up. He knew how to profile them, even if they weren't his own players. And Thomas Frank's a guy where he knows his players, he understands his players, and he understands how to get the best out of his players. Because some managers don't adapt. Some managers want to play this way, this way, this way. It's their way or no way. And they don't even make small adaptations. Ruben Amorim has frustrated me with his lack of adaptability. But recently, Casemiro, he's adapted his role a bit, so he's not having to run as much and cover as much ground. And Casemiro, the last 2-3 months of the season, has been really good for United, when back in January he was atrocious. There's little changes, and Thomas Frank is someone that does that so regularly. He makes those changes, but he's not one to overcomplicate things. He will change things tactically, but he's got a team that seem to understand him. If you look at Brentford and Brentford players, they always talk about Thomas Frank as a coach that's really easy to understand. It's really easy to understand his principles, his ideas, what he wants to do. He doesn't overcomplicate things, and his teams are always well built, they're always well drilled, and they're always tough to play against. But his teams always understand his intent and his tactics, and they seem to follow his tactics well. He's very versatile. I've obviously spoken about Ange, my thoughts on it, Daniel Levy being the real issue. But I will talk about what he'll bring to Tottenham. Spurs are going to need structure and balance, especially defensively. And Thomas Frank will build, very good, hard-working sides that press smart. There's going to be a few signings coming in, and I might do a video maybe Sunday on when we've got an indication for sure that it's Thomas Frank. Because I could be doing this whole video and we could get news coming out tonight that you're going for Marco Silva. I don't know. But once we know who the next Tottenham manager is, I will do a more detailed video on it. But he knows how to build hard-working sides that are going to press smart, that are going to be effective. He's developed, as I said, Tony and Mbeumo, Nordgaard into good players. This has become a very good player. They brought that right back on loan. I think they've done it permanently from Fiorentina. He's looked really good as well. But he's a very good manager. He's very good at getting the players on side. He's very good at organising the squad, building defensively. And I know Brentford aren't the best team defensively, but I do think he's very good at balancing. Brentford are more of an attacking side. And I do think if someone was going to replace Ange Postecoglou, Thomas Frank would make a lot of sense in that aspect. Unlike Ange's high-risk style as well, he is probably a little bit better at controlling games and organising games defensively. And I don't think he's a guy that needs massive signings. You look at Pep Guardiola and he spent 200 million in January. He's going to spend another 300, 400 million this window. Pep is a great manager, but he needs a lot of money. He needs a lot of spend. Whereas Arne Slot has come in without the spend to make it work. One thing I will say, however, about Thomas Frank is he's been at Brentford 7 years. He needs time to build. Will Daniel Levy give Thomas Frank that time to build? He is a good manager. He's a good man manager. He doesn't need massive signings. Like, as I said, Arne Slot didn't need signings to succeed. Thomas Frank doesn't need big signings to succeed. But he will need time. He will need patience to deliver results. Will Daniel Levy give him that? The fans are going to be upset that Ange Postecoglou has been sacked. The fans are going to be upset. So I think if Thomas Frank doesn't hit the ground running, the fans are going to turn on him. There's going to be pressure on Levy. There's going to be pressure on everyone. It's a big decision. So for me, that's one thing you've got to bear in mind. Will he hit the ground running? Now, I obviously did a video the other day and I said reasons to stick with Ange, reasons to sack Ange. I think it's unrealistic still with Spurs if Ange stayed next season or Thomas Frank to get instant results and instant amazing results. But Tottenham need to get back in that top 7 and push for the European football. They need to get back in that top 7 and stabilise. They've won the trophy, but they need to get back in. Ange brought energy, identity, and attacking intent. And you looked at his first season, you looked at the start of the first 10 games of this season, where I think you were 6th or 7th after that, and there was something there. But then the injuries happened, and as soon as Mickey van der Ven got injured, it goes down. But you look at his record with Mickey van der Ven fit, it is very different. Now, I think if you gave Ange another window, you gave him a top 6, you gave him a top centre-back to back up van der Ven, you gave him a top winger, and a backup to Solanke, I think Tottenham could do well. However, he's been sacked now, but I think that's what Tottenham need. But I do understand why he could be sacked and why he has been sacked, because there was tactical inflexibility in the league. In the Champions League, in the Europa League, he adapted, but in the league, there was poor performances and big moments. You know, if Tottenham didn't win the Europa League, every fan would be calling for Ange off. There was real frustration, particularly in March. There was toxicity there. The question is, they could have sacked him in March. They wait until he wins a trophy to sack him. You know, that is the question. But maybe they knew he was going to win that trophy. Maybe they knew it was the best chance of winning the trophy. Now, I would have personally kept Ange, and I think if you get Thomas Frank in, that's a really good manager. Marco Silva's good, but I would have picked Ange definitely over Marco Silva. I think Thomas Frank's good. I had a lean towards keeping Ange myself, but I do think if you bring Thomas Frank in, which it looks to be the case, that will be good. Knowing my luck, I filmed this whole video, and you probably won't get Thomas Frank now. But I'm 99% sure you're getting Thomas Frank because that's what the media is suggesting. But you never know. Maybe he'll say no. But I just feel like you've sacked him because surely you've got some indication. I don't believe Tottenham would have sacked Ange without knowing who their next manager was going to be. I don't believe that. But then it's Tottenham. You never know. Thank you for watching. Bye.